My sister's boyfriend spent Thanksgiving insulting our family, claiming we were culturally inferior because we weren't Italian like him. So, I made his own bloodline shame him. My sister's boyfriend Lorenzo came to Thanksgiving dinner and spent the entire meal explaining why our food was inferior to Italian cuisine. He picked up the turkey and said in Italy they'd never serve such dry meat because Italians understood moisture and flavor. He looked at our mashed potatoes and laughed, saying his nonna would cry if she saw us eating processed potatoes instead of handmade gnocchi. He actually took my grandmother's pumpkin pie, which she'd won county fair ribbons for, and said Americans didn't understand dessert because we hadn't grown up with proper Italian dolce. He kept saying we couldn't help being culturally inferior because we weren't blessed to be born Italian. My sister Amy sat there glowing like he was reciting poetry instead of insulting her entire family. Lorenzo refused to eat anything except bread, and even then he complained it wasn't real bread because real bread only came from Italian bakeries using ancient techniques passed down through generations. He told us about his family's villa in Tuscany that had been in their family for centuries, and how we'd never understand the connection to land and tradition that Italians had. He said his bloodline could be traced to Roman senators and that Mediterranean genetics were scientifically superior for intelligence and creativity. My dad asked him what he did for work, and Lorenzo said he was between opportunities because American companies didn't appreciate the Italian approach to business, which was about relationships and style, not vulgar profit-seeking. Amy jumped in to say Lorenzo was too sophisticated for regular jobs and was waiting for the right position that honored his heritage. Lorenzo spent the rest of dinner teaching us Italian words incorrectly, saying we were pronouncing them wrong even though my cousin Maria spoke fluent Italian from her semester in Rome. When Maria corrected him, he said she'd learned tourist Italian, not the pure dialect his family spoke. He claimed his family owned vineyards and made wine that was served to the Pope, but Americans wouldn't understand because we drank beer like barbarians. He said his mother was personal friends with Armani, and his uncle invented a type of pasta that was served in Michelin star restaurants. Every story got more elaborate and every comparison made us sound more pathetic for not being Italian. The next week, Lorenzo invited us to his apartment for what he called an authentic Italian feast to show us what real food tasted like. Amy begged us to come and support Lorenzo's cooking. We arrived to find Lorenzo had made spaghetti with jar sauce that he'd doctored with dried herbs. He served it on paper plates and called it rustic Italian style. He'd bought grocery store breadsticks and said they were grissini from his family's bakery. The salad was iceberg lettuce with bottled dressing he called his nonna's secret recipe. We all pretended it was amazing while Lorenzo lectured us about how we were finally experiencing true Italian culture. That's when I decided to do some research. Lorenzo's last name wasn't even Italian. It was actually Anderson, and he'd changed it on social media. His parents lived in Ohio and ran a hardware store. The villa in Tuscany was a vacation rental they'd stayed at once for 3 days. His nonna was very much alive and living in Cleveland, not making pasta in some Italian mountain village. I found her on social media, and she seemed lovely, posting recipes for Midwest casseroles and pictures from her church potluck. I reached out to her saying I was Amy's sister and would love to learn more about Lorenzo's family traditions. She was thrilled and immediately started talking about how Lorenzo had always been creative with stories since childhood. She said he'd been obsessed with The Sopranos in high school and started pretending to be Italian, even though they were Scottish and German. She was worried about his lying but thought it was harmless. I invited her to Sunday dinner without telling Lorenzo. When she walked in, Lorenzo went white. She hugged him and said in her thick Ohio accent how nice it was to meet Amy's family. Amy asked if this was the nonna from Italy, and Lorenzo's grandmother laughed, saying she'd never been to Italy in her life, but she'd love to go someday. She brought her famous green bean casserole and started telling stories about Lorenzo growing up in suburban Columbus, how he played Little League and was in the chess club. She showed pictures of teenage Lorenzo at Comic-Con dressed as Mario, saying he'd always loved Italian characters, his own cooking show, and make up stories about traveling to France to learn from master chefs, even though he'd never left Ohio. Amy sat completely still at the table, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles went white. The rest of us tried to look anywhere else, at our plates or the ceiling or out the window, but it was impossible not to watch this whole thing fall apart. Lorenzo kept interrupting his grandmother, trying to explain that she was talking about when he was a child, and didn't understand the nuances of regional Italian dialects. He said his family spoke a rare Tuscan variation that most Italians wouldn't even recognize, which was why it seemed different from what she remembered. His voice got higher and faster with each excuse, and sweat started showing on his forehead, even though the dining room wasn't warm. His grandmother just smiled and kept swiping through her phone, completely missing how desperate he was getting. She found his high school graduation photo and turned the screen toward us. There was Lorenzo in a blue cap and gown, standing on a normal suburban lawn with a basketball hoop visible in the driveway behind him. The house was plain beige siding with black shutters, the kind you see in every middle-class neighborhood across America. She zoomed in on Lorenzo's face and said how handsome he looked that day, how proud they all were. She talked about how he was accepted to State University, and his parents drove him up to move into the dorms, helping him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs in the August heat. She laughed about how his dad had to make 4 trips because Lorenzo insisted on bringing his entire collection of cooking magazines. Amy's face had gone from confused to pale, and I could see her doing the math in her head, comparing every story Lorenzo had told her against what his grandmother was casually revealing. Lorenzo stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. He said his grandmother was confused, that she was mixing him up with a cousin who looked similar. His voice cracked on the word cousin and his hands were shaking. His grandmother looked up at him with genuine surprise and said she only had one grandson, just him, and she'd never forget a single detail about his life. She pulled up another photo without even pausing, this one showing Lorenzo's parents standing in front of a store with a huge banner reading, Anderson Family Hardware, established, 1987, stretched across the entrance. His mom and dad were cutting a ribbon with oversized scissors, both of them grinning, and you could see rows of tools and paint cans through the windows behind them. She said this was from the grand reopening after they renovated, about 5 years ago, and Lorenzo had been there that day helping stock shelves. Lorenzo tried to grab the phone from her hand, but she pulled it back, looking hurt and confused by his reaction. Amy pushed back from the table and said she needed to use the bathroom. Her voice came out flat and strange, like she was trying very hard to sound normal. She walked out of the dining room without looking at anyone, and I heard the bathroom door close and lock. For a few seconds, we all just sat there in this horrible silence, Lorenzo standing frozen by his chair, and his grandmother looking between all of us like she'd missed something important. Then I heard it. This muffled sound through the bathroom door that was clearly crying. I got up and followed, knocked quietly, and said it was just me. Amy unlocked the door, and I slipped inside to find her sitting on the floor with her back against the bathtub, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. She looked up at me and asked how she could have been so stupid to believe everything he said, her voice breaking on every other word. I sat down on the floor next to her and didn't say anything at first because what could I say that wouldn't sound like I told you so? She pulled her knees up to her chest and started talking about the past 6 months, how she'd defended Lorenzo to her friends when they said he seemed pretentious. She'd actually bragged about dating someone with such an exotic background, someone who'd grown up in a villa and had family traditions going back centuries. She told her roommate about his connection to Italian nobility and his family's wine that was served to the Pope. She'd posted photos of them together with captions about her sophisticated European boyfriend, who understood art and culture in ways Americans couldn't. Every single thing she'd said about him to other people were based on complete lies, and now she had to face the fact that she'd been either incredibly naive or willfully blind. She said the worst part was remembering all the times something seemed off, like when he couldn't answer basic questions about Italy, or when his Italian pronunciation sounded wrong even to her untrained ear, and she'd just made excuses for him in her head because she wanted the fantasy to be real. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes while she cried and talked through everything, and I just listened because that's what she needed. Eventually, she wiped her face with toilet paper and said we should go back out there, that hiding in the bathroom wasn't going to change anything. We walked back to the dining room to find Lorenzo and his grandmother standing on opposite sides of the table in what looked like a standoff. He was trying to explain that he'd been embracing his spiritual heritage, that he felt Italian in his soul even if his bloodline was technically Scottish and German. His grandmother's face showed this mix of hurt and disappointment that made her look 10 years older. She said she didn't understand why their family wasn't good enough for him, why he had to pretend to be someone else entirely. Dad cleared his throat and asked Lorenzo directly why he changed his name and invented an entire false identity, his voice calm but firm in that way that meant he was actually angry. Lorenzo's whole body seemed to collapse inward. He sat back down in his chair and put his head in his hands, and when he started talking, his voice was so quiet we had to lean in to hear. He said he always felt boring and ordinary growing up in Ohio, just another average kid in an average town with nothing special about him. When he got to college, he started telling people he was Italian, and suddenly they found him interesting, wanted to hear his stories, treated him like he was cultured and sophisticated instead of just some hardware store owner's son. He said it started small, just claiming his family was Italian, but then people asked questions and he had to make up answers, and each lie required another lie to support it until he'd built this entire fake history. He looked at Amy and said he knew it was wrong, but by the time he met her, he was in too deep, and he thought if he told the truth, she'd never want to be with boring regular him. His grandmother's face showed disappointment mixed with real concern, like she was seeing for the first time how deep her grandson's problems went. Amy stood there for a long moment just staring at Lorenzo, and I could see her working through everything in her head. Then she told him to leave, her voice shaking but firm. Lorenzo started apologizing, saying he did it because he loved her and wanted to be worthy of her, that he'd planned to tell her the truth eventually. Amy cut him off and said lying for 6 months wasn't love, it was manipulation, and she couldn't trust anything about him anymore. She said she didn't even know who he really was because every single thing he told her about himself was fake. Lorenzo tried to argue, but his grandmother put her hand on his arm and said they should go, that he'd done enough damage. They left through the front door, his grandmother giving us an apologetic look over her shoulder, and we heard Lorenzo's car start up and drive away. Our family sat in uncomfortable silence for what felt like forever. Nobody knew what to say or where to look, and the tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Then Mom started laughing. just a quiet chuckle at first that grew louder. She said she couldn't believe he'd served us jarred sauce and called it his Nana's recipe when his actual Nana made green bean casserole. Dad joined in, saying the part about his family inventing pasta shapes was particularly bold. The tension broke like a popped balloon, and suddenly we were all sharing the most ridiculous things Lorenzo had claimed. My uncle brought up how Lorenzo said his uncle was personal friends with Armani, and my aunt mentioned the wine served to the Pope. Cousin Maria was laughing, so hard she had tears in her eyes, talking about how he'd corrected her Italian pronunciation when he clearly didn't speak a word of the language. Amy sat quiet through all of this, not laughing but not crying either, just processing everything that had happened. Over the next few days, Amy stayed at my apartment because she couldn't face going back to her own place where she'd spent so much time with Lorenzo. She went through their text messages on her phone, reading back through months of conversations with new eyes. She found photos he'd claimed were from his family's villa, that reverse image search showed were stock photos from a vacation rental website. She discovered stories about family traditions that made no sense now, like the time he said his family celebrated a specific saint's feast day that she now realized he'd just made up. Every message and photo became evidence of how thoroughly he'd deceived her, and each discovery seemed to hurt her all over again. She showed me a text where he'd described his Nana's pasta recipe in detail, claiming it had been passed down for generations. And we both just stared at it, knowing his real grandmother probably had the recipe written on an index card in a kitchen drawer in Cleveland. Amy deleted his number from her phone and blocked him on social media, saying she needed a clean break from the whole mess. A couple days after Amy deleted Lorenzo's number, her roommate Cecilia stopped by my apartment. She stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees and asked if she could come in to talk about Lorenzo. I let her inside and she sat on my couch, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. She said she'd been suspicious of him for months but didn't want to upset Amy because her friend seemed so happy. Cecilia described how Lorenzo would contradict himself constantly about basic Italian facts, like claiming his family was from Sicily one week and Tuscany the next. She said he'd mispronounced common Italian words that even she knew from high school Spanish class, words that sounded similar enough that his mistakes were obvious. Cecilia told me about the time Lorenzo claimed his family made their own olive oil, then later said they imported it from a specific region, then changed the story again to say they sold it at their restaurant. She'd kept track of these inconsistencies in her phone notes because something felt wrong, but she couldn't prove anything concrete. She showed me the notes and there were dozens of contradictions, from the number of cousins he claimed to have to whether his Nana lived in a village or a city. Cecilia said she'd tried to hint to Amy that Lorenzo's stories didn't add up, but Amy would get defensive and accuse her of being jealous. She felt terrible now for not pushing harder or doing her own research like I had done. I told her Amy needed to figure it out herself, and that sometimes people have to learn these lessons the hard way, even when it hurts to watch. Amy called me later that week saying she wanted to apologize to Nona Anderson for the awkward dinner. She felt embarrassed that Lorenzo's grandmother had witnessed the whole confrontation, and probably thought our family was crazy. I gave her the number and Amy disappeared into her room for over an hour. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she seemed calmer than she'd been in days. She said Nona Anderson had been incredibly kind and understanding about the whole situation. His grandmother explained that Lorenzo had always been obsessed with being special and different, even as a little kid. She told Amy about how he'd go through phases where he'd claim to be related to famous people or pretend he had talents he didn't actually have. Nona Anderson thought he'd outgrown it after high school, but clearly the lying had gotten worse instead of better. She said Lorenzo's parents had tried to get him help when he was younger, but he'd refused to admit there was a problem. Amy asked if his grandmother knew why he'd chosen to pretend to be Italian specifically, and she said he'd always romanticized Italy after watching mob movies as a teenager. He'd convinced himself that being Italian would make him more interesting and confident, and eventually the lie became his whole identity. Then Nona Anderson told Amy something that made everything even sadder. Lorenzo's parents didn't even know about the fake Italian identity, because he barely talked to them anymore. He'd distanced himself from his family over the past few years, too busy maintaining his fake persona to deal with people who knew the truth. His parents thought he was just busy with work and his social life, not realizing their son had created an entirely different person. Nona Anderson said Lorenzo's mom and dad were worried about him, but didn't know how to reach him when he kept them at arm's length. She asked Amy if she'd be willing to talk to them because they were concerned about their son's mental health and his disconnect from reality. Amy agreed immediately, saying she wanted to understand what had happened and maybe help if she could. Nona Anderson gave her their phone number and said they'd be grateful to hear from someone who'd seen what Lorenzo had become. I watched Amy go through all of this and felt weird about my own role in exposing Lorenzo. Part of me felt vindicated because I'd been right about him being a fraud and saved my sister from wasting more time on a liar. But another part felt guilty seeing how much pain Amy was in, crying at night and questioning every moment of their relationship. I kept wondering if there had been a gentler way to reveal the truth, or if the dramatic confrontation at dinner had been too harsh. Ruben, a family friend who'd helped me dig up information about Lorenzo's real background, stopped by to check on Amy. He found me sitting on the back porch staring at nothing and asked if I was okay. I told him I felt like I'd done the right thing, but in the worst possible way. Ruben sat down next to me and said Amy needed to know the truth, even if the method was harsh. He pointed out that staying in a relationship built on lies would have hurt her worse eventually, maybe after she'd invested years instead of months. He said sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is show them an ugly truth before they get in too deep. I asked him if he thought I'd been cruel, and he shook his head, saying I'd been protective. He reminded me that Lorenzo had insulted our entire family at Thanksgiving, and continued lying to Amy's face every single day. And that wasn't my fault. Amy met with Lorenzo's parents at a coffee shop downtown the following week. She came back to my apartment afterward and told me they were genuinely kind people who seemed as confused by their son's behavior as we were. They'd apologized repeatedly for Lorenzo's treatment of our family and the lies he'd told Amy. His dad explained they'd tried to get Lorenzo into therapy for years because of his lying habit, but he was an adult, and they couldn't force him to get help. His mom said they'd noticed him pulling away from the family and creating these elaborate stories, but they didn't realize how far it had gone until Nona Anderson called them after our dinner. They showed Amy pictures of Lorenzo as a kid, a normal suburban boy playing in the yard and going to the school events. Nothing like the sophisticated Italian he pretended to be. His parents said they'd tried to talk to him about his lying multiple times, but he'd get angry and defensive, insisting he wasn't lying but embracing his heritage. They'd eventually stopped confronting him because it only pushed him further away. Amy told them she appreciated their honesty, and that she hoped Lorenzo would get the help he needed. His mom hugged her and said she was sorry Amy had gotten caught up in their son's problems. 2 weeks after the dinner confrontation, Amy got a long email from Lorenzo. She showed it to me, and I read through his apology and admission that he needed professional help. He wrote that creating the Italian persona had made him feel confident and interesting for the first time in his life. He said he'd always felt boring and ordinary, and pretending to be from this exotic background gave him an identity that made people pay attention to him. He admitted he knew it was wrong, but he'd gotten so deep into the lie that he didn't know how to stop without losing everything he'd built. Lorenzo said his parents had found him a therapist, and he'd started going to sessions twice a week. He wrote that he understood if Amy never wanted to speak to him again, but he wanted her to know he was genuinely sorry for the pain he'd caused. He said the lies had started small in college and snowballed until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. He thanked her for the time they'd spent together, even though it was based on deception, and said he'd always remember her kindness. Amy spent a whole day thinking about how to respond to Lorenzo's email. She wrote and deleted several drafts before finally settling on something short and clear. She told him she appreciated the apology and was glad he was getting professional help, but she needed space and they couldn't be together. She wrote that she hoped therapy would help him figure out why he felt the need to create a fake identity, and that he'd find peace with who he really was. Amy said she needed to move forward without him in her life, and that she hoped he'd respect that boundary. She told me later that it felt good to set that boundary clearly, instead of leaving things open or giving him false hope. She said writing the email helped her close that chapter and start thinking about what came next. She admitted she still felt stupid for believing everything Lorenzo told her, but she was trying to be gentle with herself about it. At our next family dinner a few weeks later, Amy surprised everyone by bringing Nona Anderson as a guest. His grandmother had become an unexpected friend to Amy during their phone conversations, and they'd bonded over the whole strange situation. Nona Anderson brought her famous green bean casserole again, and this time everyone actually enjoyed it without the tension of exposing Lorenzo's lies. She shared real family recipes and stories about growing up in Cleveland, talking about her parents who'd immigrated from Scotland and the neighborhood where she'd raised her kids. She told us about meeting her husband at a church social, and how they'd built the hardware store from nothing. The stories were simple and honest, nothing dramatic or exotic, but they felt genuine in a way Lorenzo's fake Italian tales never had. Amy sat next to her laughing at stories about young Lorenzo getting into normal kid trouble, and the real connection between them seemed better than any of Lorenzo's manufactured drama. Nona Anderson said she was grateful Amy had reached out because it helped her understand what her grandson had become. She told us she was hopeful the therapy would help him find his way back to himself. My cousin Maria, who Lorenzo had dismissed for speaking tourist Italian, pulled Amy aside after dinner. They sat on the front steps talking for a long time while the rest of us cleaned up inside. Maria told Amy she'd been so angry watching Lorenzo insult her language skills when he clearly knew nothing about Italian. She said she'd wanted to call him out at Thanksgiving but didn't want to cause a scene or embarrass Amy. Maria admitted she'd looked up some of the phrases Lorenzo used, and they were either completely wrong or didn't exist at all in any Italian dialect. Amy apologized for not standing up for Maria when Lorenzo was being disrespectful, saying she'd been so caught up in defending him that she'd ignored how rude he was being to her own family. Maria hugged her and said she understood, that sometimes when you're in a relationship you can't see things clearly. They talked about the signs Amy had missed, and the red flags she'd ignored because she wanted so badly to believe Lorenzo was this amazing person. Maria said the experience taught them both something about trusting their instincts when something feels off. A few months passed and Amy started dating again, though she approached it completely differently than before. I noticed she asked way more questions now and paid attention to small inconsistencies in what people told her. She'd fact-check stories casually, not in an obsessive way, but just staying aware of whether things added up. Amy told me the Lorenzo experience had taught her that if someone seemed too good to be true, or constantly needed to prove how special they were, it was worth investigating before getting emotionally invested. She said she'd learned to value authenticity over excitement, and that someone's real story was more interesting than any fake persona they could create. She went on dates with normal guys who had regular jobs and honest backgrounds, and she seemed happier even though the relationships were less dramatic. Amy said she finally understood that real connection came from being genuine with each other, not from one person performing an elaborate character for the other. Nonna Anderson started showing up at our Sunday dinners every other week, and honestly, she fit in better than Lorenzo ever had. She brought casseroles with names like Church Potluck Surprise and Midwest Medley that tasted way better than anything Lorenzo had pretended to make from scratch. She told stories about working at the hardware store and teaching Lorenzo to ride a bike in their driveway. Normal family stuff that felt real instead of made up. One Sunday, she mentioned that Lorenzo had started therapy and was talking to his parents again after months of barely calling them. She said the therapist was helping him figure out why he needed to invent a whole fake life instead of just being himself. Nonna Anderson looked sad when she talked about it, like she blamed herself for not noticing how bad the lying had gotten. Amy told her it wasn't her fault, that Lorenzo was an adult who made his own choices about pretending to be someone else. Dinners with Nonna Anderson became something we all looked forward to because she was genuinely funny and warm without trying to prove anything. 6 months after the big confrontation, Amy was doing better than I'd seen her in years. She started dating a guy who worked in accounting and drove a normal car and didn't have any secret identities or fake backstories. She told me she'd learned to pay attention when something felt off instead of ignoring it, because she wanted the relationship to work. Amy actually thanked me one night for exposing Lorenzo, even though the dinner had been brutal and embarrassing. She said she'd rather deal with one painful truth than spend years believing comfortable lies that would eventually fall apart anyway. Our whole family got closer after everything happened, like we'd all survived something weird together and came out stronger. We still joke about Lorenzo's jar sauce and his fake Italian accent, but mostly we're just glad Amy got out before things got worse.